On this question, the expression right here for all permissible values of x is equivalent to which of these? Let me write it out like we're used to seeing it a little bit better. Cotan of x plus cosecant of x all over secant of x plus 1. So that's the same as which of these? Well, we're going to have to simplify it to find out. And so probably the first thing we should do when we see things like cotan and cosecant and secant is break them into, write them as sines and cosines. So let me write that. Write as sines and cosines, because remember, all the trig functions really are made out of sines and cosines. So come down to the your formula sheet, which is a little bit further down here. There it is. So your formula sheet, right here, cotan is cosine over sine, cosecant's 1 over sine, secant's 1 over cosine. There they all are. All right, let's go back up and do that. So then this becomes, so this cotangent will become cosine of x over sine of x plus, and then the cosecant, that's 1 over sine x all over. Secant, that is 1 over cosine x plus 1. Okay, so what should we do with this now? How can we combine this? Well, when you have, so let me write a note for you about fractions over fractions. When we have fractions over fractions, do you see how we have that right here? We have fractions over fractions. So when you have that, multiply all the terms, top and bottom, by LCD over 1. And what is the LCD? The LCD equals 1 of each type of item under a small bar. So if you look at the items like that guy, that guy, that guy, those are the items. We're not talking about the major bar. We're talking about the items under the small bar. So we have 2 sines and a cosine. We're supposed to take 1 of each type of them. So that means the LCD in our case is going to be 1 sine and 1 cosine. Does that make sense? Because we have this, this, and this that are under the small bars. So 1 sine and 1 cosine. And what do we do with it? We multiply all the terms in the problem by the LCD over 1. So I'm going to come in there and do that. So I'm going to multiply by sine, times cosine over 1. Sine times cosine over 1. Sine times cosine over 1. And sine of x, cosine of x over 1. So you multiply every term. Every term. Let me separate this here. So you multiply every term, all the terms, top and bottom, by LCD over 1. And then you cross cancel, right? Sine cancels sine. So what's left here? Cosine times cosine. Cosine squared. Plus sine cancels sine. What's left? Cosine. Over. On the bottom, cosine cancels cosine. What's left? Sine. Right, that goes here. These guys go there. This guy goes here. And right here, this is just sine x, cosine x, because there's nothing else. There's just ones. Okay, now this looks a little bit weird. What should we do with this? This is not an easy problem for sure. Well, if you notice on the top, these guys both have a cosine. So I can factor out a cosine, leaving behind cosine plus 1. Do you see that? See what I just did there? If I was to take this cosine and go boom, boom, cosine times cosine would be cosine squared, and cosine times 1 would be cosine. It would go back, wouldn't it? I could redistribute and it would go back. So I just took out the common cosine. That's called factoring, taking out the greatest common factor. Since they both had cosine in common, I took one of them out, taking away a cosine from each of them. That left one cosine here and just a 1 there. If I was to remultiply this, cosine times cosine, cosine squared, cosine times 1, cosine, it would go back. Let's do the same thing on the bottom. Look at these two terms. What do they have in common? Well, they both have a sine x, don't they? So what does that leave? Sine x times what will go back to sine x? Well, just 1. And sine x times what will go back to sine cosine? Well, cosine. Right? Sine times 1. So let me show you again. Sine times 1 will go back to sine, and sine times cosine will go back to sine cosine. So I took out the sine they have in common. Okay? So now, where does that leave us? Well, this can cancel this, right? The order of adding doesn't matter. You know that. Think about numbers. 2 plus 3, 3 plus 2, it's 5 either way you do it, doesn't matter. Same thing with 1 plus cosine or cosine plus 1. This and this are the same. They cancel. So what am I left with? Cosine x over sine x. What's that? That's cotangent x. Remember that from our definition? So here's our answer. Cotangent x. That's the same as cotangent x. So that was some pretty tricky simplification. There we go.